The world is changing fast, and America is no longer the unstoppable superpower it once was. Many countries are breaking free from U.S. influence, choosing to make their own decisions, form new alliances, and take control of their future. Nations are now moving away from depending on the U.S. dollar, making new trade deals and rethinking military ties. Once loyal allies are shifting their focus to self-reliance and regional partnerships, creating new economic and political powerhouses. As this massive global shift continues, one big question remains: what does this mean for America's power in the world? Let's dive into the 10 countries where the U.S. is losing its grip in 2025. Number 10, Indonesia. Indonesia is slowly stepping away from America's influence, choosing to focus on itself and build stronger ties with its neighbors. As Southeast Asia's biggest economy, Indonesia is making bold moves to become more independent instead of following Western powers like the U.S. One of the biggest changes? Indonesia is pushing for economic independence. The country is building its own industries, developing massive infrastructure projects, and expanding trade deals with China, Asian nations, and other global partners. But that's not all. Indonesia is also looking for new ways to trade without depending on the US dollar, joining the global trend of de-dollarization. Politically, Indonesia is taking a neutral and independent stance. While it still cooperates with the US on security matters, it refuses to pick sides in global power struggles, making it one of the world's strongest, non-aligned nations. Instead of relying on Western influence, Indonesia is now leading Southeast Asia through ASEAN, pushing for stronger regional unity and economic independence from the West. As Indonesia continues to grow in power and influence, its focus on self-reliance and regional partnerships is making America's grip on Southeast Asia weaker. Number 9, France. France is slowly pulling away from America's influence, pushing for a stronger and more independent Europe. President Emmanuel Macron has been one of the loudest voices calling for Europe to stand on its own politically, economically, and militarily. Instead of relying on the US for military protection, Macron believes Europe should build its own defense system and depend less on NATO, where the US has the most power. Economically, France is also challenging America's dominance. Many European nations, including France, are frustrated with the US dollar's global control and are exploring new ways to trade using alternative currencies. This is part of a bigger effort to strengthen the euro and avoid being affected by US economic policies and sanctions. But that's not all. France has also criticized US foreign policies, especially its approach to China and military actions around the world. Macron has warned that Europe should not just follow America's lead, but instead make its own decisions based on its own interests. While France is still an ally of the West, its push for independence is shaking up its relationship with the US. With one of Europe's most powerful nations choosing its own path, America's grip on Europe is starting to weaken. Number 8, Pakistan. Pakistan is quietly stepping back from America's influence, choosing to build stronger ties with China and other regional allies. For years, the US saw Pakistan as a key strategic partner, but things are changing fast. Now, Pakistan is focusing on self-reliance and finding new allies instead of depending on American military aid and financial support. One of the biggest reasons for this shift? China's massive investment in Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project, has flooded Pakistan with Chinese money and development. This has made Pakistan less dependent on US financial aid and the international institutions controlled by Washington. But that's not all. Pakistan is also changing its military strategy. Instead of buying weapons mainly from America, it is now getting advanced defense equipment from China and Russia. This shift weakens US military influence over Pakistan like never before. Tensions between the US and Pakistan have been rising over issues like counterterrorism policies and regional security. Because of this, Pakistan is looking for new friends. It's strengthening ties with Russia, China, and Middle Eastern nations while keeping a more balanced approach instead of following Washington's lead. With stronger trade, military deals, and political ties outside of the US, Pakistan is clearly breaking free from America's grip. The big question now is, will Pakistan's new alliances reshape global power in Asia? Number 7, Germany. Germany, once one of America's strongest allies, is now rethinking its relationship with Washington. The world is changing fast, and Germany is no longer blindly following US leadership. But why? Let's break it down. First, the energy crisis after the Ukraine war exposed a major weakness. Germany relied heavily on Russian gas, and when that was cut off, energy prices skyrocketed. Struggling to keep its economy stable, Germany is now looking for new solutions that don't always fit with US interests. But there's more. Germany is leading Europe's push for independence. Instead of depending on the US for military, economic, and technological support, Germany is joining France in building a stronger, self-reliant Europe. This means less control from Washington and more power for Europe itself. And here's the real shocker. Germany is not cutting ties with China despite US pressure. China is Germany's biggest trading partner, and industries like cars and manufacturing heavily depend on Chinese markets. Even though the US wants its allies to reduce business with China, Germany can't afford to follow that demand. So, what does this all mean? Germany is still a US ally, but it's slowly stepping away from American influence. With its growing ties to China, a stronger European identity, and a new approach to global power, Germany is changing the game, and America might not like it. Number 6, Mexico. Mexico, once one of America's closest partners, is slowly stepping away from Washington's grip. While the US is still Mexico's biggest trade partner, something shocking is happening. Mexico is building stronger ties with China and other global markets. One of the biggest game changers? China's growing investment in Mexico. Over the last few years, China has pumped billions into Mexican manufacturing and infrastructure, offering a new source of economic power that reduces US influence. At the same time, Mexico is rethinking its dependence on the US dollar, joining a growing trend of countries trying to diversify their economies. But it's not just about money. Political tensions between Mexico and the US are also pushing them apart. Disputes over trade policies, immigration, border security, and sovereignty have caused major friction. Battles over tariffs, supply chains, and border rules have forced Mexico to look for new partners to protect itself from US economic pressure. Even though Mexico is still deeply connected to the American economy, it is quietly becoming more independent. As the country strengthens its global influence, the question remains, is Mexico preparing for a future where it no longer needs the US? Number 5, South Africa. South Africa, once balancing between the West and rising global powers, is now turning toward BRICS, a group that challenges Western control over the world. This move is slowly reducing US influence, not just in South Africa, but across the entire African continent. But why is this happening? The biggest reason is South Africa's deepening friendship with China and Russia. China is now South Africa's biggest trading partner, investing huge amounts of money in mines, factories, and massive infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, South Africa refuses to turn against Russia, even as the West pushes for stronger action. Instead, the country is standing its ground and keeping strong diplomatic and military ties with Moscow. And there's more. South Africa has openly criticized US foreign policies, especially when it comes to economic sanctions, military invasions, and pressure tactics used to control other nations. South Africa is calling for a new world order where Western countries don't have all the power. It's also pushing for big changes in global organizations like the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund so they are no longer dominated by the US and Europe. So what does this mean for the future? While South Africa still has some ties with the US, its growing loyalty to BRICS, strong bonds with China and Russia, and fight for a more independent world are seriously weakening American control over the region. The balance of power is shifting fast, and Washington might not be able to stop it. Number 4, Brazil. Brazil, the biggest economy in Latin America, is slowly pulling away from US influence and choosing a more independent path. While it still trades and cooperates with Washington, its leaders are making bold moves to reduce reliance on the US. But what's driving this massive change? One major reason is China's growing role in Brazil's economy. China has now overtaken the US as Brazil's biggest trading partner, buying huge amounts of Brazilian soybeans, iron ore, and oil. This means Brazil's economic future now depends more on Beijing than on Washington. And here's something even more surprising. Brazil is pushing to move away from the US dollar. Along with other BRICS nations, it supports alternative trade systems that use local currencies, making it less controlled by the American financial system. Politically, Brazil is standing up to the US. Its leaders are supporting a world where smaller nations have more power, instead of letting Western countries dominate. Brazil has also been very critical of US policies on trade, military actions, and environmental issues, favoring a diplomatic approach that benefits Latin America and BRICS nations. So, what does all this mean? Brazil is no longer just following the US, it is building stronger ties with China, playing a bigger role in BRICS, and pushing for economic independence. This massive shift is slowly weakening American control over Latin America, and the world is watching closely. Number 3, India. India, once a close US partner, is now choosing its own path, reducing its dependence on Washington and building stronger ties with other world powers. While India still works with the US on trade and defense, it is making shocking moves to weaken American influence over its policies. But why is this happening? One of the biggest reasons is India's push for self-reliance under its Atmanirbhar Bharat, Self-Reliant India initiative. Instead of depending on American weapons and technology, India is building its own defense industry and buying more military equipment from Russia, even ignoring US sanctions on Moscow. On top of that, India has been purchasing Russian oil despite Western pressure to stop, proving that it prioritizes its own national interests over what Washington wants. And it doesn't stop there. Economically, India is strengthening ties with BRICS nations, especially China and Russia, and challenging US financial control by reducing its use of the US dollar. Instead, it has signed trade agreements allowing transactions in local currencies, making India less dependent on American banking systems. Even in global politics, India is playing it smart. It is part of the US-led Quad alliance with Japan and Australia, which is meant to counter China's influence, but at the same time, India refuses to join Western sanctions against Russia and continues to make its own independent choices. So, what does all of this mean? India is no longer following orders from Washington, it is becoming a truly independent world power. By focusing on self-reliance, strategic alliances, and balanced foreign policies, India is slowly reducing US control and rising as a global force that answers only to itself. Number 2, Turkey. For decades, Turkey was a loyal US ally and a key member of NATO. But things are changing fast. Under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey is making bold moves to break free from US control and is choosing a more independent path. One of the biggest shocks? Turkey is getting closer to Russia. Despite NATO warnings, Turkey bought Russian S-400 missile defense systems, which led to US sanctions and Turkey's removal from the F-35 fighter jet program. But Ankara didn't back down. It continued trading with Russia, even when the US and Europe imposed harsh sanctions after the Ukraine war. And guess what? Turkey is also strengthening ties with China. It has expanded trade and infrastructure deals as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative and is slowly moving away from the US dollar. Instead, it's doing more business in local currencies, making Turkey less dependent on Washington's financial system. Politically, Erdogan is defying US influence in the Middle East. Turkey is taking its own path in conflicts involving Syria and Iraq, openly challenging US policies in the region. It has also opposed American support for Kurdish groups, which Turkey sees as a major security threat. So, what does all of this mean? Turkey is still in NATO, but it's no longer blindly following the US. Its closer ties with Russia and China, push for economic independence, and bold foreign policies are making it a powerful, unpredictable force on the world stage. The era of US dominance over Turkey is fading fast. Number 1, Saudi Arabia. For decades, Saudi Arabia and the US were like best friends, working together on oil, security, and defense. But now, something shocking is happening. Saudi Arabia is slowly pulling away from American influence and building stronger ties with China and other global powers. One of the biggest surprises? Saudi Arabia is now selling oil in Chinese yuan. This challenges the US dollar's dominance in global trade and could shake up the entire financial system. For years, Saudi Arabia only sold oil in dollars, which kept Washington in control. But now, the kingdom is rewriting the rules. But that's not all. China has become Saudi Arabia's biggest trading partner, investing heavily in energy, infrastructure, and technology. And guess what? Saudi Arabia is getting closer to BRICS. The kingdom has even expressed interest in joining the group, which would push it further away from US influence. And here's another shocker. Saudi Arabia is making peace deals with Iran, and China is helping. For years, the US and Saudi Arabia were united against Iran, but now Riyadh is negotiating directly with its former rival. On top of that, Saudi Arabia is relying less on US military support, choosing to handle its own security affairs with a more independent approach. So, what does all this mean? Saudi Arabia isn't completely ditching the US, but the days of full American control are fading fast. With its deepening ties to China, growing role in BRICS, and move away from dollar-based oil sales, Saudi Arabia is reshaping global power, and Washington is losing its grip.